Let's rank the Browns' biggest offseason needs. We'll do it coming up next on the Locked On Browns podcast.
You are Locked On Browns, your daily Cleveland Browns podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Dog Pound? I'm Spencer Sherman, your host of the Locked On Browns podcast, and proudly covering your Cleveland Browns each and every single day in the land and on the road. We are ranking the Browns' biggest offseason needs today. I have a good, solid list for you. Also, speaking of one of their offseason needs, could the Browns' answer at left tackle actually be on the roster already? And an important connection to keep in mind when it comes to the Browns' newly appointed quarterback coach. I do want to thank you for being an everydayer with the Locked On Browns podcast and making us your first listen every single day. Today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL. Use code all lowercase LockedOnNFL to win $50 instantly when you play just $5. And as promised, we will start off the show by ranking the Browns' biggest offseason needs. I think people kind of have a general sense of what these position groups are, what the needs of the what the needs of this team are this offseason, and we know quarterback certainly chief among them, which is why we're actually going to start in. We're going to go 1 to 5. I don't know, a lot of times when you do rankings like this, you start at 5 and you work your way up to 1, but because 1 feels like it's such an obvious one, I'm not going to actually start there with you. I'm going to, I am going to start there with you rather, and we're going to work our way from 1 to 5 instead. And I have an honorable mention that I want to get to as well. So with that said, I won't waste any more of your time. We'll get right into it. And I think the number one need of this team, as has been bandied about for weeks already, is, of course, the quarterback position. The Browns need to identify in some way, shape, or form who their quarterback is, whether that is in the draft at number 2 overall, or maybe later on in the draft if they so choose, or if it's going to be a veteran that they trade for, sign, whatever, in the offseason, bring in to sort of bridge the gap and see if they can get this offense back on track. Or maybe a combination of both, because I could see them doing both things. I actually think they will probably do both things. I think they will sign some version of a veteran to maybe be the guy at the forefront of the quarterback competition at the start of camp, and then that could lead into at some point transitioning over to, okay, here's our quarterback, our rookie quarterback that we see taking the reins sort of the rest of the way and being our starter for years to come, or, you know, the rest of the season or whatever, if there's some sort of transition that it were to happen mid-season like that. So I think that one's obvious. No qualms about that one, I don't think, from anybody. I think everyone's going to certainly agree that quarterback is the number one need of the Cleveland Browns this year. That brings us to need number 2. And I still, I'm still putting this one pretty high, although it will segue into a conversation that I want to have coming up about the left tackle position and whether or not there's one already on the roster or not. But I think left tackle remains the next biggest need for this team. Listen, it's a spot on the offensive line that you need to shore up. We know Jed Wills isn't coming back. I mean, I would be floored if he did. I think that's run its course. It was a missed pick in the first round by Andrew Berry, obviously, and a guy that just has not become the player that anybody thought he would become, transitioned from the right side to the left side from his Alabama days. And so, yeah, like he's not the player that door is closed. It's time to move forward. And it's a position that Andrew Berry has to get right on a spot, by the way. Like, this offensive line group, they're aging. They're getting a little bit older. And you need to start getting young up front, and you got to identify the right guy to be that left tackle and man that spot for years to come, especially if you do draft a quarterback with the number 2 pick that you're envisioning being your starter for a long period of time and for the foreseeable future. Like, you want somebody to help protect that side of the O-line, and just to sort of start shoring up that group in different places with younger players that are kind of on the come up. So I still put that as my number 2 need. I think it's massively important. And we will have a conversation coming up, though, about whether or not the Browns actually have an answer at that spot on the roster already. So that's that's a future conversation in this episode. So stay tuned for that. But that does bring us to need number 3. And this is where I think there could be some differentiation from person to person, fan to fan. Maybe you feel differently than I do, but I do think that number 3 thing on the list should be defensive end. I understand you have Myles Garrett. I get that. That's always going to give you a chance to be competitive and really wreak some havoc as a defensive unit, especially if you can get the right pieces and parts in the middle of that group and obviously bookending it on the other side opposite of Myles Garrett. But I've said it before, like the Browns have done this run a pass rusher program for several years now, and it's worked in with some solid results. I mean, I think Zadarius Smith was the best of the guys that they've brought in during this phase. And you know, he I think this past year was playing even better than he was the year before alongside Myles Garrett before they traded him because the season had just gone in the toilet completely. But finding somebody who's a young, controllable asset player at that opposite of Myles Garrett, I think would be huge, especially as he flirts with this idea of, hey, maybe one day I want to go somewhere else to win Super Bowls. Now, I don't know that that's ever going to happen, but he is going to start getting older. Like he's late 20s. Once he turns the corner into his 30s, that's where teams start to worry. The red flags start to pop up about age and injury and staying healthy and all those different things. And so finding somebody that can be a bookend on the opposite of Myles Garrett, be his kind of running mate on the other side of the defense that's younger and gives you some hope for the future at that position, I think is massive. And it would be awesome if this organization could find somebody to be sort of the next generation of pass rusher for the Browns. And so for that reason, I got to put defensive end as the number 3 need, I think, on this team. And also, I just think you can never have too many of these guys. You can never draft too many defensive ends. You can never have too many defensive ends. It's a position that requires a lot of depth, especially in Jim Schwartz's defense. And so I like that as my number 3, my number 3 on the list. Number 4, and I think this could vary from person to person as well. I'm going to say that I think running back is my number 4 biggest need for this team. And I know what people are thinking. There's another position on offense that a lot of you might have ahead of running back, and I understand why. We'll talk about it coming up. But I just think running back is key here because I've said it already. I think Nick Chubb's coming back. I think they will work something out with him, bring him back next year. But at this point, how much can we bank on Nick Chubb getting back to the player that he was? He's going to likely be on a 1-year incentive-based deal, and maybe there's still something in there. I do believe there's still something in there for Nick Chubb. I just don't know what level of Nick Chubb we're going to get after another season-ending injury. So as they pivot back to Kevin Stefanski's offense and this wide zone play action system, it feels like you need to upgrade that position. You need somebody that is a more reliable, younger back. I know you got Jerome Ford, and he's shown some promise, but I just think you need something, you know, a young player that can invoke some life into that position. The run game was terrible this year, all things considered. And some of that was the blocking scheme up front and what they were trying to do, and they had sort of pivoted away from that. Ken Dorsey, not known for really his running prowess as an offensive coordinator. So I think to bolster that position, to add some life to it, getting a new sort of face of that group or a new frontline guy, not a new face maybe because Nick Chubb will always be the face if he's on this roster, but a new frontline guy would work wonders for this team as they go back to the Kevin Stefanski offense. And I've already talked about my love for Quinshon Judkins as an example. I think that's a massive, massive hole for them to fill. And if this person that comes in, it's a deep running back class, so maybe we can wait a little bit. But if you find the right guy and pair him with Nick Chubb and Jerome Ford, I think it could be a solid group all around. But I do think it's a little bit more important than my next one, which my number 5, as we're doing the top 5 ranking here, is the wide receiver position. I think wide receiver is still a need. I think as you look at this room, you have a group that is sort of a mishmash right now with Jerry Jeudy proving that he can be a number 1 wide receiver. That was encouraging last year. But what is it going to look like around him? Well, though that remains to be seen. I don't think Elijah Moore's coming back. I have a lot of high hopes for Cedric Tillman as he continues to sort of grow in his role in this offense and with this team. But there are some questions, obviously, about where else, like what else, who else they could go pursue and who else they could get to sort of fill out that group specifically. And so I'm interested to see how they do that. Maybe it's through the draft, maybe it's through free agency. We know that the Browns haven't really been able to draft and develop wide receivers. So I am kind of leaning towards maybe address that one in free agency or via a trade and use your picks on some of these other needs. But I do think wide receiver is still a need, and you need to figure out what that group looks like behind Jerry Jeudy. But I have it lower on the list than I guess probably some others do. I will also throw out, and I mentioned this earlier in the week, as an honorable mention, tight end. I don't think we're talking enough about tight end being a need. I just think it felt like David Njoku sort of lost a step this past year, and getting bolstering that group, especially again, knowing how much Kevin Stefanski likes to use multiple tight ends in his offense, I think it would be a smart move for them to at least invest in that position this offseason and try to find some other options and some other depth additions to add to the group. That's my top 5 ranking. What is yours? I want to know what your Browns offseason needs list consists of from 1 to 5. You can let me know in the comment section at the YouTube channel here for the Locked On Browns, or you can hit me up on Twitter at @SpenceT2_. Speaking of this list, I mentioned left tackle being the number 2 need. What if it's already on the roster, though? I will talk about that coming up next on the Locked On Browns podcast. This is a message from our sponsor, Intuit TurboTax. Taxes are waiting and wondering and worrying if you are going to get any money back. And then waiting, wondering, and worrying some more. Now, Taxes is matching you with a TurboTax expert who can do your taxes as soon as today. An expert who gives your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find you every deduction possible and file every form, every investment, everything with 100% accuracy, all so you can get the most money back guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now that is Taxes. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with the TurboTax Live Full Service. Real-time updates only in the iOS mobile app. See guaranteed details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. All right, so I talked about left tackle being one of the biggest needs for the Browns this offseason. I put it number 2 on my ranking, and I'm sure others have it equally as high or close to as high. It is a massive position they need to fill this offseason. That is no secret at all. Now, that said, there is an interesting scenario here where the Browns maybe don't invest a higher pick potentially in that position because maybe they feel like they already have one on the roster as is. Now, I don't know how others feel about this, but DeJuan Jones was in a situation where he got moved to left tackle out of sort of necessity. Jack Conklin was playing well. Jedrick Wills was struggling. He was hurt. And so he gave it a whirl. And there were several games throughout the season where they stuck with DeJuan Jones over Jedrick Wills, even though he had worked his way back to being healthier and maybe ready to play. And DeJuan got the start instead. And then DeJuan got hurt, and that obviously derailed things. And he goes out for the year. And then Jedrick Wills, I don't even think after that, he might have not even played after that because the injuries, I can't remember off the top of my head now, but because the injuries, like, derailed his season as well. But Jones is interesting because I do think like Jack Conklin solidified himself as coming back next year. His biggest concern is injuries. That seems like it's the biggest concern for all these linemen at this point. But like Jack Conklin's back next year, he's your right tackle. And in an ideal world, I think DeJuan is your right tackle of the future. But understanding that there's somewhat limited resources this offseason. You have a lot of things to sort of address on the menu of things that you kind of have to take care of. So what are you going to do at that position if you prioritize other things? It's not I don't know that it's the worst thought to just keep DeJuan Jones over there and see if he can be your left tackle for an extended period of time or maybe of the future, whatever. And I say this understanding, like if you go to PFF and you read up on DeJuan Jones and you go back and watch the tape a little bit, as I've done several times, like you understand, like he wasn't perfect. He wasn't great. And the PFF grades for him this past season, 46.4 overall grade. His pass blocking grade was 57.6. His run blocking grade, 45.8. So we're not talking about like exceptional, But the old cliche about offensive linemen always tends to be, if you don't hear their name getting called, then like on the broadcast or, on the PA system, or where you don't really notice them, then they must be doing something right. And I think there's some truth to that. I know it's a very baseline way to look at any of those positions on the offensive line, but there is some truth to the idea that, like, if you're not hearing that person's name called constantly and they're not making mistakes or getting flagged or getting just completely blown by or run over, they're doing something to protect the quarterback and do their job correctly. So I think Dawand did fine. Like, I think he did well enough that I'm at least intrigued to find out more about whether or not he can truly be this team's starting left tackle moving forward into 2025, 2026 and beyond. And if it doesn't work out, okay, no one's the wiser. Jack Conklin's not going to be on this roster forever. At some point, they're going to have to move off that contract, and you could just move Dawand back to right tackle. I know he struggled early in the year, especially when he was actually playing right tackle before Jack Conklin was back. And I attribute some of that to him just kind of getting back into the swing of things with his after he was coming off the knee injury the year before. He was playing through his injuries through training camp and spring training camp, etc., leading up to the season, whereas Jedrick Wills wasn't doing that. And so he didn't have the time to really like get fully healthy. And then he had that stretch where they went to Conklin and Wills, and he got a breather. He didn't really play and kind of got benched in a way, but he talked about how it was actually the best thing for him. He flat out said that it helped him heal up, and they wanted him to focus on that. And that allowed him to then come back and start at left tackle for Jedrick Wills and do a pretty solid job, all things considered, because he felt like he was finally healthy again. So that can't be understated. The biggest concern with Jedrick Wills at this point is the same concern I mentioned with Jack Conklin. It's the health. Can he stay healthy? Because now 2 years in this league and 2 years suffering injuries that cost him, obviously, his season in some capacity. So that's the biggest worry now at this point is, like, can he be the guy that stays healthy and actually is out there for you for the length of for the majority of a 17-game season? And that is to be determined. So I get where there's still some concerns there. And that's why, for me, it is still a massive need, because I almost feel like Dawand needs to just become like your swing tackle at this point, and he can play both sides if you need him in a pinch, but that you still address that with a frontline player, maybe in the draft or probably in the draft, because I think that's where you're just going to get the best value for what you're looking for. But I still think you need to address that in a different way and maybe make Dawand your swing tackle. But yeah, like, I'm at least interested and intrigued by the idea that maybe the Browns, as they try to put this roster together in the most creative way possible without having to, with the sort of strapped resources they have because of the salary cap situation and Deshaun's contract and all these things, figure it out for a year with Dawand Jones potentially is an option. It's a card that they could play. It's an avenue that Andrew Berry could turn into. So we will see if that actually comes to fruition and how they feel about him as a left tackle, an everyday left tackle, or if they feel like it's still a priority and something that they need to address. But because Dawand Jones at least put himself in the conversation by the way that he played during last season, and I think it's worth talking about, because again, when you're in the situation the Browns are in, you have to kind of get creative to fill certain needs and certain holes on your roster. And maybe that's one that you can, I hate to use this terminology because we say it so much with the Browns and we say it so much with Andrew Berry when it comes to the way he negotiates contracts and adds the voided years and kicks money down the road, but kicking the can down the road, if you will, like, okay, we'll go out there with Dawand Jones next year, see how it goes, and then know that maybe that's a top need for us in 2026 potentially. Can you afford to do that? Especially if you get a rookie quarterback that you're banking on being your franchise guy. That's the big question. You'd like to have both those things kind of shored up at the same time. Like, okay, we got our left tackle, we've got our of the future, we've got our, we're bolstering the offensive line to protect this guy just so that he doesn't get hurt. But sometimes that's not the hand that you're dealt, and sometimes it's not a perfect world. And you got to sort of pick and choose, like, okay, this offseason, these are our priorities, and this offseason, these are our priorities. So maybe left tackle is one that you wait on. We'll see how the Browns feel about it. But I do think it's interesting that they at least have that option at their disposal. And while I would still prioritize the left tackle, I could see them maybe taking that path or pivoting to that to give it a try, at least for a year, before they maybe make it a higher thing that they address via the draft or otherwise. There is an interesting connection that I didn't get a chance to talk about yet, because the Browns promoted from within Bill Musgrave to be their quarterback coach. And there's a connection here that should be intriguing to Browns fans in terms of what quarterback they may be looking at. I will talk about it coming up next on the Locked On Browns podcast. It was a glorious football season for me, because it ended with the Ohio State Buckeyes, the team I'm very much a fan of, winning the national championship. And I get to say that I saw the Buckeyes in person this year. That's right. My wife and I went to the Michigan game. It was disappointing from a result standpoint, but a fun experience all around, that I'll forever have that memory of seeing the national champs in person in 2024, thanks to Gametime. I'll tell you, my ticket buying experience went so smoothly ahead of the game that Gametime has now become my go-to app for buying tickets. Plus, they have a new feature called Gametime Picks, which makes it much easier to get your tickets to your favorite events by allowing you to filter out the fluff. Essentially, it shows you incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. You can also see views from your seats that you're looking to purchase. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Game time. So there's an interesting connection being formed between the Browns' new quarterback coach and potentially one of the quarterbacks that they could be looking to take in the NFL draft. And it's notable because as we talk about Andrew Berry at the Senior Bowl, discussing his conversations with Shedeur Sanders and how he doesn't think it's going to be a problem for Deion Sanders that if his son got drafted to Cleveland, and that he believes they would maybe take care of him, and it is a place that he can thrive. That is important to note as we, in terms of like the context of where we're at and what these teams are sort of looking to do here. Because listen, the Browns continued to promote from within, and they continue to make hires that have interesting connections to this rookie class of quarterbacks. They already did that by hiring Tommy Rees, and essentially he worked firsthand as the offensive coordinator at Alabama with Jalen Milroe for one season in 2023. And, you know, it provided him some interesting context and some interesting insight into, you know, that player and who he is. And so maybe that leads to the Browns being intrigued at the very least by him and wanting to potentially be the guy that they draft and bring in to be their quarterback moving forward. Now we'll see how that goes. But the bigger thing here is for the other quarterback that has an interesting connection now to the Browns is Shedeur Sanders, and not necessarily directly, but because of his dad, because of Deion Sanders. And basically the Browns this week promoted Bill Musgrave to quarterback coach. And Bill Musgrave has an interesting connection with Deion Sanders because they did play together in 1994 as part of the San Francisco 49ers, a team that, mind you, went on to win the Super Bowl. And Deion, interestingly, has actually talked about how one of his favorite stories from his playing career, one of his favorite memories from his playing career, was he was friends with Bill Musgrave. And Bill Musgrave in, I guess it would have been Super Bowl 29 between the 49ers and the Chargers, he advocated for Bill Musgrave, and you can find this audio somewhere. I don't have it with me to play, but you can find it out there somewhere. But he talked about how one of his favorite memories was playing in that Super Bowl and advocating for Bill Musgrave to actually play. Because obviously Bill Musgrave was the backup. Steve Young was the starter. He was brilliant, one of the best quarterbacks of all time, had 6 touchdowns in that Super Bowl game. But Bill Musgrave got into the game on Deion Sanders' advice and threw a pass in a Super Bowl, had that memory forever, like a cool kind of moment that Deion reflects on and says is one of his favorite moments. And so he's friends and close with Bill Musgrave. And so that's why I don't know that the Browns are like doing these things intentionally. Like, oh, well, we got this guy because he knows about this. We got Tommy Reese because he knows about this quarterback. And we got Bill Musgrave because he knows about that quarterback. But it is interesting to connect those dots and realize like how much of a fraternity this league is and how that stuff matters to people when you're trying to draft and develop players and who they have connections with and who they don't. And so you hear Andrew Berry say, I don't think that's going to be a problem in terms of Deion intervening or stepping in and trying to like put his foot down on his son going to Cleveland. Well, maybe this is part of the reason why. If there's people he trusts inside that organization to make sure that his son is in a good spot and with people that he trusts to develop him the right way at the next level, the Browns now have that. And so again, it could mean something, it could mean nothing. You can use either scenario, Reese being the OC, Musgrave being the quarterback coach, to link the Browns to either of those quarterbacks and say like, oh, see, this is why they did this. So I'm not trying to go like, rabbit hole conspiracy theory here, but I did find it interesting that they made that hire this week. It certainly continues to at least feel like another tea leaf to read in relation to the Browns having interest in this quarterback class and as they evaluate them, exploring like what their options are and who they like. And so we'll see if it means anything or if it means nothing. But I do think like it's not a coincidence that the week they announced that, Andrew Berry is also sitting there telling you the week they announced Musgrave as the quarterback coach, he sits there and tells you, I don't think that's going to be a problem. If we drafted Shedeur, that Deion would be on board with it. He'd be okay with it. So again, just trying to connect the dots here. It was a connection that I didn't make initially, and now it sort of registered, and I was like, oh, yeah, that's right. And so worth keeping an eye on, worth thinking about as we continue to sort of assess and figure out where the Browns' heads are at in relation to the quarterback class, in relation to drafting a quarterback. And again, in the months ahead, we'll learn even more about what they want to do, what their intentions are, but certainly feels like quarterback very much in play, very much on the menu, especially with Kevin Stefanski showing up to these events to evaluate them for this team at number 2. Another episode down with you, Dog Pound. Thanks for joining me as always to talk about your favorite football team during the offseason. We got plenty more to talk about tomorrow and in the weeks and months ahead. And I hope you continue to make us your first listen every single day. For your second listen, go find one of the new Locked On NFL shows where you can keep it local. Check out Locked On Cavs, Locked On Guardians. Thank you, as always, for being an everydayer at the Locked On Podcast Network. I will talk to you again real soon, Cleveland. Peace.